Hi guys, and welcome to the next in the series of videos on HSC Chemistry in this topic of chemical monitoring and management. This is video number 8, and we're going to investigate cations and the ways that we go about identifying different types of cations in this particular video, in contrast to the anions we looked at in the previous one. So, just as we looked at ways of carrying out different tests for the presence of certain anions, we also need to be able to describe ways of testing for the presence of certain cations, and the ones that are listed in the syllabus are these. So we need to look for the presence of lead, for calcium ions, for barium ions, for copper, and also for iron. And the two forms of iron are iron 2 and iron 3. These also go by the names of ferrous or ferric. And so in combination, you might see ferrous chloride or ferric chloride, and these are the terms that are used to describe each of those. Just like we did with the anions, we can also use both qualitative, colours of the flame or precipitate, and quantitative testing in order to identify not only what cations are present, but how many there are, depending on whether we're just identifying something as being present or absent, or whether we're specifically looking at the amounts. In the same way that we did the test for anions, we can also test for cations in the same way. So what we need then is a series of tests in order to mostly, in this case, precipitate out each of these particular ions from a solution. So the first test is the addition of chloride ions. Now, most chlorides are soluble, but lead is slightly soluble. So as long as the concentration is sufficiently high, we will get a precipitate of lead chloride. And this will be a solid. And this will form with the addition of lead to a sample containing, the addition of chloride ions to a sample containing lead. Another one that's quite, I guess, a very colourful one is lead iodide. And lead iodide is a nice yellow precipitate. It used to be used on the road markings, but now we try and avoid putting too much lead into the environment. But it's a very nice bright precipitate, and you may have seen it being formed. If you warm it slightly and then allow it to crystallize, it forms almost like glitter. So it's a very attractive substance, but not a particularly nice one, as it contains lead. Barium is something that we, I guess, should already be aware of, because barium was actually one of the cations that we used to test for the presence of sulfates. And so therefore, just as we can use barium to test for the presence of sulfates, we can use sulfate ions to test for the presence of barium, and that gives us barium sulfate solid as a precipitate, just like our previous one, and it's a white precipitate as well. But now we actually can start to add in a different type of test. And one of the other important tests that we need to be aware of that we can use for cations but not for anions is flame. So if we put some of the sample into, say, a Bunsen burner flame, and we want to make sure we turned it onto the blue flame, so there was no orange color, which was going to affect our results, then we get a sort of a pale or apple green color for barium. So it's a paler green, but it is nevertheless a positive result for barium ions when you put them in a flame. So we've got two tests now for barium ions. One, a precipitation test, which uses sodium sulfate ions, and one which is a flame test. We likewise have two for the presence of calcium ions. Calcium ion will also form a precipitate with sulfate, and of course this is one of the reasons we need to be very careful with some of our testing, because both of these form white precipitates. They're both insoluble in water, and so therefore just adding sulfate to a solution which we know contains both or either of barium or calcium and getting a white precipitate is not a positive result. But the flame test is a positive result between these two. So if we were to add some sulfate, got a white precipitate and we don't know whether it's barium or calcium, then putting in the flame would be very easy, because the calcium, unlike the barium, gives a really brick red flame, very bright flame. And obviously, assuming you're not colorblind, the difference between the red and the green is very stark. So calcium sulfate as a precipitate, or a red flame color as a positive result for calcium. Then copper. Copper is, I guess, one of these substances that you can almost identify before you start doing any experiments with them, because copper is fairly characteristically blue color, and obviously sulfate doesn't work because we're familiar with copper sulfate being a solution, so it's soluble, but a very distinct blue color. However, we can find a nice precipitate with hydroxides. Most hydroxides are actually insoluble, and copper hydroxide forms a nice blue precipitate. So that is a positive test for the presence of copper. Anything which is a blue solution is probably already going to be a bit of a clue that it is going to be copper. But the other thing is that the flame color is a sort of a bluey green. So a very distinct difference between the flame color of the barium and another positive way of identifying the difference between copper, barium, and calcium, and also lead. And then the last one that we need to look at are the two forms of ion. Okay, it's always difficult to talk about ions, and it makes it more difficult when there are two. These ones both are going to be useful for testing with the hydroxide ions as well. And the main reason for that is that we have two different colors. The reason we're looking at these is because while they both form precipitates, the Fe2+ ion forms a green or sometimes a white precipitate, which may ultimately turn brown as it changes from Fe2+ to Fe3+, but the Fe3+ one is already a brown. So when we first form these, we get a clear difference between each of these two. There's no flame test for this one, just as there is no flame test for lead. Sometimes it kind of sparks a little bit, and it's not a good test, so we don't use the flame test for iron. You can actually see that there's a couple of other substances. Thiocyanate ion produces almost a blood red solution, but again, for reasons that are probably fairly obvious, we don't tend to use cyanate ions very often in the science laboratory. So here's a nice little rundown of ways of identifying different cations in solution. Adding a chloride, so sodium chloride is a simple solution we can add to provide the presence of chloride ions. And again, remember that it's the group 1 metals that are almost entirely soluble, and so therefore they're not going to participate in the reaction. They're going to remain as spectators. And sometimes acid solutions are also chosen because, again, the H+ ion is going to remain in the solution, may change the pH a little, but it's going to not participate in any precipitation reactions, and therefore any precipitates that we form are going to be a consequence of the anion part of the acid reacting with a particular cation that hopefully we're testing for. To review the flame tests, these are not very easy to see. I sort of realize they've come up quite poorly on the slide, so my apologies, and I should have checked that beforehand. But what we have is lithium, and lithium forms a carmine or a dullish red coloured precipitate. Sodium is yellow, and this yellow colour is very similar to the colour that you see on the Bunsen burner flame when the hole is closed, that sort of orangey yellow colour. And so that's one of the reasons why sodium, we often will test it last. It tends to dominate and remain around for some time. Potassium is a very nice flame colour. It's a lilac colour or a very soft pinky purple colour, a very pretty flame. And then calcium is the sort of orangey red, often referred to as brick red. If you want something that's even redder, then you go for strontium. Strontium has a beautiful red coloured flame. And then two others that we've mentioned on the previous slide, barium and copper. Barium has that sort of an appley green, like a Granny Smith kind of green apple color. And then the copper itself forms more of a bluey green colored flame. So these are the different ways that we can identify cations from their flame color. Now notice these are only cations. We can't identify anions this way. So usually there'll be solutions of nitrates or chlorides because they're pretty much all soluble. And so those solutions we'll just put into the flame and just see what colors come as a result of that. The chemistry behind this is really about electrons moving from one shell to another. They take in energy, goes in order for them to move from one shell to another. And when they return, so we would call the original shell their ground state, and their further one their excited state. And they get excited through the addition of energy. When they return from the excited back to the ground state, they release a little pocket of energy out, and that wavelength may correspond to something within the visible spectrum that we can see. And if that is the case, then we see that as a color coming out. So again, as with the anions, there is also a flowchart for cations, and I won't go through the whole thing again, but you can see that if we start with the addition of chloride ions, that is going to give us our lead coming out. Once the lead is out, we can collect that as a precipitate and then use the filtrate to carry out the next ones. You'll notice that in this case, it's often easier to start with a fresh sample each time. With the anions, we could kind of do everything in the one beaker. With this one, we really want to take our sample and we want to separate it into different, say, test tubes in order to carry out each of these tests independently to see what happens. So after we've added our chloride ions, we then add our sulfate ions. Remember, if there's a positive test for the sulfur, for the sulfate ions, then we're not sure whether we've got barium or calcium, so we can do flame testing. Or another test we could do if we just want to stay with precipitation is the addition of sodium fluoride. Now, if you get a precipitate, then you get calcium fluoride. That precipitates out. The barium does not, so no precipitate. The barium will remain in. So it's another test to separate calcium and barium on the basis of just precipitation. Of course, the other thing you can do with these is to whack them both in a flame, and the colors that will come out will be very different. The greenish color for the barium and the reddish color for the calcium. And with your third fresh sample, you'll add some hydroxide ions, and then you get three very nice distinct colors, one of which will indicate the presence of copper, one of which will indicate the presence of the ferric ions, the Fe3+, and one the ferrous ions, the Fe2+. So these are the sorts of questions, again, they're unknown solutions. In 2007, there was a question which was part of a bigger group, writing equations and those sorts of things. But specifically what you had was 4 substances: barium nitrate, hydrochloric acid, lead nitrate, and sodium carbonate. And remember that now we have some understanding of cations and anions, and what we want to do is to identify the 4 solutions and to see what results we can get from that. So the first thing we need to do is we notice the bubbles, and the bubbles is a really good one to start with because it means that those bubbles are carbon dioxide gas. It's the only gas that's produced. The rest of them are all precipitation reactions. This is a great result. So in order for us to get carbon dioxide, we have to have a carbonate. Okay, and generally speaking, what we will also have is an acid. The acid plus carbonate will give us salt plus water plus carbon dioxide. So that means the sodium carbonate must be 1 or 2, and the acid, hydrochloric acid, must be 1 or 2. Now the next one that I think is interesting is this one here, no reaction. Now the 2 things that would be most obvious that would give you no reaction are the 2 that have the same anion. So lead nitrate and barium nitrate reacting together or put together will just have nitrate ions in there. Since they're both soluble already, there'll be no reaction. However, one of these must be solution 2, and we already said that solution 2 must be one of sodium carbonate or hydrochloric acid. So what sort of reaction are we going to get? Well, the problem with the carbonate is that most carbonates are insoluble. They will produce precipitates. So it's more likely that we're going to get something if we go with the chloride ions if we want no reaction. So if, for example, solution 2 we say is the hydrochloric acid, so let's make a little 2 next to hydrochloric acid, then which one of lead nitrate or barium nitrate will give us no reaction? Well, the problem that we have is that lead, when it reacts with chloride ions, lead chloride is slightly soluble. So it will perhaps form a very weak precipitate if there is sufficient concentration in there, but it's possible that we could actually get a precipitate of lead chloride with those two there. So I would be happier if we said that if a reaction between 2 and 4 was occurring and we said 2 was hydrochloric acid, barium chloride is soluble, definitely soluble. So let me make the barium chloride 4. Now, by a process of elimination, that means the sodium carbonate must be 1 and the lead nitrate must therefore be 3. What you can then do is go through and double check each of your observations to make sure that this is correct. So if we put 2 and 3 together, we're putting the hydrochloric acid with the lead nitrate. And I just mentioned that the lead chloride will give you a precipitate, so that works out okay. So then 1 and 3, 1 is the one is the sodium carbonate and 3 is the lead nitrate. So a white precipitate here, this white precipitate will be lead carbonate. This one here will be lead chloride. And then 1 and 4 is sodium carbonate and barium, and so this one's going to be barium carbonate. And this is one of the problems with the carbonates, is most of them are insoluble and will give you precipitates. Thanks for watching.